customer demands are increasing and growing every day. And I think any marketer or sales or, business leader can appreciate that. But what I think it's done is it's put pressure on businesses to really put customers at the center of their thinking, not just as an afterthought or a checklist at the end of a product being developed or a marketing plan being built, but really, orienting the business's decision making around the customer. That's probably the number one reason why CMOs are gradually evolving into CCO type roles. Chief Customer Officer really is that customer-centric thinker within the organization that is really thinking end to end on how to optimize the customer experience to drive growth and retention and loyalty.
Welcome back to another episode of Growth Unlocked. I'm your host, Kieran Krohn. Over the past decade, the CMO role has been under a lot of pressure. Businesses are realizing that growth just doesn't come from marketing and sales alone, but really from delivering outcomes for customers. That shift has, given the rise to a new exec seat at the table, which you might have heard of, the Chief Customer Officer. Today, I'm joined by Gina McCartney, who is the founder of Getting Traction and a former REA Group leader, who back in 2017 was actually pushing for the creation of a CCO role. We're going to unpack today how the role came to life, how it compares with the CRO, and what it means for the future of go-to-market leadership. Gina, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get stuck into it. So over the past decade, we've seen the CMO role evolve into something far bigger, in many cases kind of becoming that Chief Customer Officer. From your perspective, what's been driving that shift?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think the first is that customer demands are increasing and growing every day. And I think any marketer or sales or, business leader can appreciate that. But what I think it's done is it's put pressure on businesses to really put customers at the center of their thinking, not just as an afterthought or a checklist at the end of a product being developed or a marketing plan being built, but really, orienting the business's decision making around the customer. So I think that that's probably the number one reason why, I guess CMOs are gradually evolving into CCO type roles. But I think the other thing is that the worlds of B2C and B2B have really collided. It used to be a really distinct strategy to be a B2C marketer or a B2B marketer, for example. But as, consumers become more savvy, consumer of one, and especially when you think about SMEs as an example, who really behave as consumers, I think a typical CMO type role has really evolved into a B2B and B2C type remit. And what that's naturally evolved into is marketers having this really sort of not just a nice to have commercial capability, but a must have commercial capability. And marketers are best positioned and often sort of inadvertently are the voice of the customer and have been playing that role. But the Chief Customer Officer role really brings that into sort of like an official state and, accountability, which is really exciting, I think, for marketers.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And I love that, what you touched on before around that commercial and business acumen, particularly as businesses have, started to really kind of try to drive more alignment between different departments. And at the end of the day, it's the alignment and people working together and moving in the same direction is what's really going to move a business forward.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, the actual Chief Customer Officer's remit. What are the core responsibilities that absolutely define that type of role?
Well, Kieran, if you talk to a sample of 10 businesses, it's probably different for every single business and organisation, which, doesn't make it easy for the aspiring Chief Customer Officer to kind of figure out their next gig necessarily. But at its core, Chief Customer Officer really is that customer-centric thinker within the organisation that is really thinking end to end on how to optimize the customer experience to drive growth and retention and loyalty. Now, when you think about the type of functions that might contribute to that, classically, it's, customer service, customer success, and customer experience. And so you're sort of like that CX cohort as well. But we know that marketing plays a big role across all of those capabilities. And we know that sales also has a role in those capabilities as well. So in some examples, I've seen chief customer officers, I guess, nurturing and looking after the very customer experience focused parts of the business. And in others, I've seen that full end to end. So, for example, in my role as Chief Customer Officer, I had the end to end remit of sales, marketing, success, and service. So I think depending on the business size, it would also depend on which functions sit under a Chief Customer Officer. And in other organisations, customer product can sit under a Chief Customer Officer role. So I think the variables there are, how big is the organisation, how capable is the leader, what is their experience, and yeah, so it can be many different things, but really in its most basic form, on the hook and accountable for ensuring customers have the best experience and value possible.
Mm. Yeah, I love it because I mean, again, it kind of comes back to that creating alignment between different departments, right? With the pure focus on driving better outcomes for the customer, which is ultimately, what's going to really drive sustainability, profitability, and growth for any kind of business.
Yeah, and it's sort of it's not funny so much, but it is sort of funny that it's really common sense. You think if a customer's happy, they're getting what they want, they'll pay the top dollar, and they'll keep paying and they'll stay loyal, and that's a great business model. And that's very simple, and that's been the truth for forever. It's just now that businesses maybe over the last decade are really realizing the value in that, and I think especially in tougher economic times or where there's really fiercely competitive industries and markets, being really good at retaining your customers and growing the value, whether it's a lifetime value or, AOV, whatever, becomes paramount. So I think it's now, companies have realized this is not just a nice to have, this is a necessity for us to actually, drive not just growth, but sustainable growth.
Absolutely. Because when you look at what's shifted through COVID and was, more and more businesses coming into market in different industries, the rising cost of acquisition, as well as potentially like decreasing win rates on, customer acquisition, the, the I guess the friction and the difficulty or the challenge around acquiring a new customer versus retaining an existing customer is pretty black and white, right?
Yeah.
Yet I still see a lot of businesses that are very much kind of focused on, if you looked at the bow tie reporting model, like on the left with acquisition, and then on the right with retention, expansion, and renewals, it still seems like a lot of businesses are still looking at the left side of that equation, and the right is becoming more important, but the left still does seem to receive the most attention, the most budget, and the most focus for a lot of businesses, which is pretty crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about this and why that is. I think there is a big challenge too when you think about the product and tech associated with improving something that exists. It might be in old systems, old platforms versus building something new. Um, Apart from the complexity that might come with sort of old systems and platforms and tech, and that's difficult, and there's an overhead to that. It's also kind of cool and fun to be working on the new entrepreneurial product or service. So I think there's a big sort of cultural thing associated or driving that as well, which is where I think a lot of the challenges lie, because purely from a marketing perspective, which is just one piece of the puzzle, I think marketers are getting much better at really understanding their customers to really sort of, understand what levers that need to be pulled to drive, retention or spend. But ultimately, if that product isn't driving more value than it traditionally has, that makes it difficult for the marketers as well. So I think that's where the CCO plays a really big advocacy role right through the line, from start to end, from inception to optimization, is really providing that feedback and guidance on what it's going to take to not just acquire a new customer, but to really keep growing and nurturing and adding more value for existing customers.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's probably worthwhile talking about the leading indicators of what typically results in a customer being happy, satisfied, seeing results, sticking around for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of concept of like time to value in terms of when they see that kind of aha moment or realize value from the products or the services they've purchased. And then obviously, there's a bunch of other measures that can go into place, particularly if it's a software product. Those things can be measured a little bit easier. A lot of businesses in the past have done NPS surveys with customers to, differing levels of success around responses. What are you seeing in terms of how businesses are measuring success, and what kind of leading indicators should business leaders be looking at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a real blend. The businesses that are doing it well is a real blend of qual and quant. So I think that always on, and whether it's NPS or a pulse check, just always having a grasp of what your customers are thinking. But I think doing it in a way that segments it so you can understand whether it's a particular segment or product or time of year or the context within a competitive market. So really understanding the why and the context behind those responses, I suppose. Um, and I think the qual, research is often one of the first things that gets crossed off when there's budget cuts, you know. And I think also, opinions start to drive decisions across businesses, which is a really, obviously, it's great to have experienced people within an organization, but it's really important to get the feedback from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So um, businesses that do it particularly well, I think they have, whether it's discussion groups or feedback sessions, they have customer forums where they might get feedback on an up and coming product and service, understanding what value looks like. But I think the businesses that are investing in listening in a multidimensional way to what customers are thinking and wanting are the ones that are building the right products and services at the right price as well. I think that's another thing that is underestimated is how much customers can help guide go-to-market decisions if you just ask. So, yeah, I think those that are investing more in listening and understanding are winning naturally.
Makes a lot of sense. The thing that I really like is how now technology can be a massive enabler of this in
Hmm.
terms of listening to conversations at scale and identifying common themes that might be recurring over and over. Most businesses now, particularly if they're serving a customer online, whether it's Google Meet or Zoom or Teams, even like phone calls, most of these conversations are getting recorded. Like consumers have become really used to this. It's just normalized now. There's so much rich insight that can be extracted from this unstructured data, and that's where AI becomes really powerful. Is how do we take these huge amounts of data, analyze it, identify these themes, look at recurring problems or challenges, or even probably beyond that, starting to identify sentiment of a customer. AI can do a pretty good job at listening for satisfaction. Is this person sounding frustrated? Are there certain things that they're saying? On the other side, are they really happy? Is there a way that we could take advantage of these different moments based off this data that's being analyzed and identified pretty consistently, and then putting that back into the CRM and then triggering alerts for people, whether you're in customer success or marketing or sales? I think there's a really big opportunity for businesses to leverage that. And that also goes back to what you were saying before around how to listen to the voice of the customer from a marketing perspective to be able to put out and refine that message to your ideal customer profile.
So I couldn't agree more, and I think it's the most under-leveraged um, AI capability in businesses because most, if not all, CRMs have that capability. We in the past used HubSpot, and we had a chatbot, and that chatbot enabled web chat, which picked up sentiment and picked up, essentially feedback on FAQs and statements that we put out in customer facing tools or on our website. And it was one of the best and cheapest ways to test messaging, actually. And I think so many teams get locked into this. Well, we have to work so hard to get something approved. We couldn't dare go back and revise it because it's going to have to go back up. And the bigger the business, the more complex that approval process is. But I think if leaders, especially, can really acknowledge that there's a always on optimization based on real time customer feedback, um, I think the results are always almost better. Um, but I think that, yeah, I would be surprised if that's not the biggest next wave of, um, I guess, enablement of AI, especially with we it's probably in customer service teams, it's used pretty well or pretty consistently, but it's how do you get all of that amazing feedback all the way up the chain and across functions to be tweaking messaging and positioning, as an always on muscle, always on go to
Mm,
market tweaking. I think it's, yeah, and it's, I think because it sounds complicated and tricky and, oh, how do you get all the stakeholders across that? And people just then think it's too much, it's too hard. So I think if people can unlock that challenge, then yeah, they'll make massive strides forward.
yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Kind of going back to some of the sort of responsibilities that you were talking about
Mm.
for the CCO role and thinking about from a go-to-market perspective, it does sound like you could almost be describing the CRO or the Chief Revenue Officer, right? Someone that
Yeah.
is kind of, aligning and sitting on top of those different functions. I think we've spoken about this previously, but I would be keen to get your take on that in terms of, how do you see the CCO role potentially, I guess, sitting alongside or even in contrast to the CRO role? Do you see many companies having both roles running simultaneously, or is it kind of one or the other?
Yeah, they are definitely different in, again, their primary focus. I think where it gets complicated is the organizational structure is where it gets a bit challenging because some CCOs have sales marketing reporting into them, but CROs also have sales and marketing reporting into them. So I think where they coexist, the CCO is definitely playing an advisory role more than a functional leadership role. But if you think about, I read this awesome, very simple sort of matter of fact statement about CMO, CRO, and CCO. CMO's role is to get people interested. The CRO's role is to get them to sign, and the CCO ensures that they're happy and they're driving advocacy. So all of those roles have a very important role within a business. But if I think about the CCO and coexisting with those roles, because and in some businesses you have CCOs, CMOs, and a CRO, a lot of Cs. Um, but in the purest form of a CCO, really playing that customer advocacy role and really driving end to end thinking, consideration, and probably challenging a CRO. A CRO, by virtue of their title, their job is to drive revenue. Um, that may be at the cost of customer experience or customer advocacy. So the CCO can really play a wonderful, buddy role to sort of keep things in balance and keep things in check. So yes, we might be growing new customers, but that by doing that initiative, we're going to erode existing customer trust, as an example. Um, so I think they're hugely complementary, but like any C-suite or any leadership team, um, my thing is role clarity. Everyone being really clear on who's sort of, I guess, the guardian of each of those key roles, and then working together to challenge each other, but also sort of help grow each other's patches through their lens of expertise as well.
Mm. Yeah, some really interesting thinking. I mean, what advice would you give to, say, like a founder or a CEO that might have a CRO in place if they're listening to this conversation and thinking, you know what, like advocacy is something that we want more of? Is that something you think that they should be putting under the remit of the CRO? Would it make sense for them to hire a CCO? What's your take on that?
That's a good question. It like any great team, it comes down to who's in that role, I think. But I think the size of the business has a lot to do with the decision making on that. So depending on how big this organization is, my advice would be to ask for the founder or the CEO to ask them the question. So who is bringing to the table the customer insights, whether that's satisfaction, dissatisfaction, retention strategies. Who's doing that thinking today? And if the answer was, well, no one is, you're like, well, we need someone to do that. Um, and depending on the CRO's capability, that might just mean hiring a little miniature CCO or a head of customer advocacy or customer retention. But I think that CRO would definitely need the support and space for someone to be focusing on that when their job is to drive more revenue, So, um, but I think, you know, there are some really highly incredible, capable people that can do that as a contributor within a team. So you wouldn't necessarily need to build out your C-suite, but just really being clear on, well, who's doing it and why isn't it happening today and what opportunity is associated with that. I think naturally that role would work closely with the CRO anyway. So whether they're a peer or reporting into them, um, as long as the thinking's being done is the main thing.
Yeah, of course. And it goes back to your point before around having clarity around roles and responsibilities and people having
Yeah.
their swim lanes and having definition around that. So yeah, it's a really good point. When it comes to the way that things have evolved over the last couple of years, Gina, I mean, based off the work that you're doing now, it seems to me that this appetite of businesses bringing on fractional leaders is something that's becoming more and more common. I think part of the reason because there is a limited market of these people that have got this expertise, but also there's sort of advantages in terms of being able to move faster by tapping into someone that's seen the film before, so to speak. Can you talk to me a little bit around that? Because obviously this is something that you're actively doing with companies at the moment. I'd love to get your thoughts on for businesses thinking about potentially bringing someone in fractional versus having someone in house. I mean, any advice around that?
Yeah, I think and look, I was listening to a Harvard Business Review podcast the other day, and there was a fractional chief product officer and a fractional chief marketing officer on this podcast, and it was really interesting hearing them talk about the value offering, because obviously not everyone can afford the salary of a full-time chief marketing officer or chief customer officer, for example, but they need the thinking and the level of thinking. So what I'm seeing in a lot of businesses at the moment is that and obviously in tough economic times as well, there's obviously teams have shrunk, so a lot of talent and certain, I guess, levels of talent don't exist in businesses anymore. But to be able to tap into someone who can think at that level for whether it's a period of time or a chunk of the week, and then provide guidance and leadership to a team to execute is super, super valuable. I think the benefits of that, you're getting the expertise at obviously a bargain rate because you're not paying the full time salary. Um, and also, it gives an opportunity. I think the other thing that's underplayed a lot is that the team that are there, so whether it's the head of marketing or GM of marketing or whatever the existing team is, they are also learning from that person. And yes, it's on a part-time or fractional basis, but they're picking up some of the skills that ideally will help elevate them into that level of thinking and capability. So for me, businesses they're getting two things. They're getting, well, three things really. They're getting access to talent at at an affordable rate. They're getting talent uplift within their teams from that person being in the business, and they're getting the work done as well. And I think having people that have, yeah, I love that analogy of seen the film before. That's priceless, and that's something it's really difficult to have if you don't have it, basically. And it brings a lot of confidence, I think, especially when there might be more junior people within the business that haven't watched the film, to stick with the analogy. It brings a lot of confidence to them that certain corners are being looked around or have been driven around before. So yeah, and I think that's why it's becoming more and more popular. And from a fractional perspective, being the fractional player, you get exposed to many different businesses, leaders. You're working with a wide variety of CEOs, different problems, challenges, and that's really refreshing. It's a really exciting space to be in. I'm not surprised that it's growing at the rate it is.
Yeah, for sure. And you would be the best person to ask you this about this because you're at the coalface. But I mean, like, what would be the most common reasons, like top two reasons why you would get brought into a business from a fractional perspective?
I think probably lack of seniority. I can't even say that word, seniority. It's
Tongue
conservative.
twister.
Yeah. I think a lack of, yeah, and whether that's probably experience and probably runs on the board would be one. And the other is that everyone is just trying to do everything at once at the moment. I think, it's really tough times out there. Everyone wants to grow. No one's budgets have gone backwards, as in, revenue budgets. And the work has to get done and has to get done quickly. So I'd say there's a capability element and a speed element.
Is there something that usually, what I found when it comes to a business having a need or a desire is there's usually some kind of critical event, something breaks or there's a fire that needs to be put out, something that typically happens is like the catalyst to them going, we actually need to do something now. Is there any kind of recurring themes that you're seeing there?
The themes have been quite different um, for each of the clients that I work with. There's been fires, um, there's been pressure from boards, and I think probably there's probably one consistent theme is where things have just been going on in a certain way for too long, and there's a level of impatience from the business, and yeah, things need to change. And I think that I do think that the businesses that have not all of not everyone is in this bucket, of course, but there have been a lot of organisations that have done massive rounds of redundancies over the last 2 years, and so I think that's put a lot of pressure on organisations to get the work done. And so a lot of businesses are bringing back in the experience through this fractional technique or approach, I suppose. Um, yeah, and I think the good news is that for the people that were made redundant or lost their roles that have now moved into fractional roles, they're really reaping the rewards because they're not only doing the work that they're great at, but across many different clients and industries. So it's a really, really interesting time.
Absolutely. It's got me thinking about something that we have been, speaking to and working on a lot of projects with our customers around this notion of, it sounds like what you're talking about there is, businesses want to or need to continue to grow because they've obviously got, they've got budgets and they've got expectations from investors, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And as they're reducing headcount, it's around like how do they grow as efficiently as possible because that's what it really comes down to at the end of the day. It's not necessarily about growth for the sake of growth. It's about making sure it's profitable and sustainable. And one role title that's been coming up quite a lot. There's actually a huge amount of roles for hire in the US at the moment. I'm not sure if you've heard of this role title of go-to-market engineer. Is that something you've come across?
I haven't worked with a go-to-market engineer, but yeah, I've heard of the role, which is yeah.
It's pretty fascinating because it's sort of this hybrid role, someone that's very technical, that understands how to leverage technology and automation and systems and AI, but also has that business acumen and that understanding of what it actually means to go to market for different types of businesses. And, we're seeing the massive rise in like interest in technology like clay,
Yeah.
which has become almost like, well, they're basically the market leader within the space that they operate in. And we're seeing now some pretty fascinating use cases around how businesses can actually leverage a mixture of data enrichment, AI, automation, and things that can, you know, in a lot of cases augment what people are doing, but actually in some places replace what certain roles are doing as well. And so I think that's something that's quite interesting when you think about these executive roles, particularly say like a CRO or a CCO, because I do think that these types of roles need to not just be great at leading people and building teams and culture and sort of aligning, but also have that technical
Yeah.
understanding, that technical acumen, whether they're doing it themselves or not, but being able to work closely with this go-to-market engineer to actually execute and drive the go-to-market as efficiently as possible.
I think it's a really exciting and powerful role because I think where go to market often can, as a we'll call it function, can fall down is that technical part, and that connecting a go to market plan or strategy with a roadmap and dev team, and there's a huge gap. So I think it's a really it feels like a unicorn that would be doing that role, but I have no doubt they'd be um, you know seeking pretty massive salaries, because that's a really unique skill set. And I think even just on that technical capability or now piece, even you think about the amount of time that's lost when you translate information from a system, like even Miro as a platform, where teams might have done brainstorming and mapping, and then someone needs to then translate that into a format that works for the executive team because they don't know how to use Miro. I think those days are quickly dying, um, because the amount of time that's lost in information translation because of whether it's lack of access or technical capability, it's really precious time. So I think roles like that, and I think the way the way the business gets around go to market, how you commercialize the operations of a business, I think is a really interesting space as well. So I have no doubt the go to market engineer would play a big role in that. There's so many dots to connect, and the faster, the businesses that will win are the ones that do that fastest, because people can have great thinkers, they can have great strategies, great plans, but actually executing is where speed becomes critical. Because if your engine, we'll call it your go to market engine, is slow, it's very difficult to get to market quickly to test and optimize, which is what you really need to be doing. So yeah, that's a really interesting. I might do a bit of googling to learn more about that role.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's going to be growing. I mean, just if you have a look at LinkedIn for the amount of companies that are hiring that position in the US. I'm not sure if there's a huge amount in Australia right now, but Australia is always a laggard, right? I'm
Yeah.
sure over the next couple of years we'll see a lot more of that, and it makes you think about like what does the future of a company actually look like in terms of the number of people that you need for these different departments? I mean, with a mixture of go-to-market engineering in place, businesses being able to leverage AI agents to take care of a lot of the kind of mundane, repetitive stuff to free people up to focus more on the strategic things like thinking and strategy and
Yep.
creative. Um, yeah, it's an exciting time. I think a lot of people are scared about it, but I think the reality is it's going to free humans up to focus on these high leverage activities.
Yeah, and I think this is where, like, back to the topic of the chief customer officer, this is where I think that role will become even more critical and um, favored, because the thinking, when you think about the understanding your customer, there's AI might be able to aggregate data and capture data and get you to a point where it's easier to understand, but making the decisions and putting the humanistic spin on that is going to be so critical to winning. um, and yeah, as you say, like, whether it's the creative or the strategy that sits behind that, um, chief customer officer is really well positioned to take the lead on that. So I think, especially with, in the world of automation, and, and I agree, there's quite a few people out there worried about their jobs and will I become redundant? I think, well, the closer you are to the human, the better off you'll be. So it's good. It's good for the CCOs.
Yeah, absolutely. Gina, if we could wrap it up by, giving one piece of practical advice to, say, a CEO or a founder today that's potentially thinking about, how to really structure their organization in the most efficient way, or potentially put on a CCO role, what would be your parting piece of wisdom?
There's a lot of factors, and I hate adding disclaimers onto advice. But you know, assuming that you've thought about your business size and what you can actually afford, and where and what stage or phase your business is in, I would say be really clear on how well you understand your customers. And if you don't understand your customers really well, intimately, about what drives them, motivates them, why they've purchased your product, why they won't purchase your product, what would make them repurchase your product, if you don't have a good grasp on that, you should consider getting someone that can. Um, and getting the insights is only the first step, of the journey. Having someone drive that thinking through the entire organization, so you have, you can really trust that someone is carrying the torch, so to speak, on customer centricity and really driving customer centric thinking through every single function across your business to ultimately grow in the right way that your business can. Because I think knowing that you've got a product that's market fit is one thing, but actually executing that in the way that means something and actually converts and drives growth is another. So I'd say if you haven't got a good grasp on that, really strongly consider putting a role like a chief customer officer in.
Amazing. Awesome. Thanks for the advice, Gina. Really appreciate your thoughts and wisdom today. If people want to follow along on your journey or learn a bit more about what you're doing, what's the best place for them to do that?
Look me up on LinkedIn, Gina McCartney. You'll see my face and interaction.
Awesome, Gina. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Growth Unlocked Beyond Scale. If you enjoyed the show, it would really be appreciated if you can leave a 5-star review wherever you consume your podcasts. And while you're there, why not subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes? If you'd like to learn about how to drive profitable scale in your business, gain clarity on your direction, and improve your business valuation, click the link in the show notes to connect with Kieran.